Welcome to Raytown Chop Shop. I'm Mike.
And I'm Austin, and this is part one of the KawaBunga build, a Kawasaki Ninja 250 powered go-kart. In this episode, we'll start by disassembling the old go-kart and the Kawasaki. Come join us as we build this monstrosity.
My cousin, Kathy, gave us a standard go-kart with a 5-horse Briggs & Stratton years ago after her boys outgrew it. Austin drove the wheels off it when he was a kid.
I found this 2011 Kawasaki 250 on Facebook Marketplace. It had been wrecked and didn't have a title, but ran perfectly. We picked it up for $350. All the damage on the bike was cosmetic, so we rode it around the yard a couple times before we put it in our shop and started tearing it apart.
Now, Austin hasn't ridden the go-kart for more than 15 years, and it's been stored away in the big barn next to my hot rod shop, and dirt, grease, mildew, and grime covered the whole thing. So we dragged it out of my barn, power washed it, and we put it in my workshop.
I drew up the preliminary plans for the KawaBunga, and we got started buying parts and materials. We picked up 15 7-foot lengths of 1-inch steel tubing, a 6-foot 4-inch by 1/4 inch piece of flat bar, and a 22 by 80 inch piece of 18 gauge sheet metal from Metal by the Foot. The grand total came out to $194.42. We also picked up some additional scrap metal they had in the bin. I knew the original seat on the go-kart wasn't going to cut it, so I ordered a racing seat from Jake's. The total cost was $49.06, including tax and shipping. I ordered front wheels and tires, rear axle bearings, mounting hubs, lock collars, and seat rails from Go Power Sports. Price breakdown is on the screen. Also from Go Power Sports, I ordered a new rear axle and rear tires and wheels. The cost is on screen. My dad's been collecting tools since the 60s, but we're going to have to notch some tubes to build the roll cage, so I picked up a tubing notcher and hole saws from Harbor Freight.
With the go-kart power washed, Austin and his fellow Eagle Scout, Chris, brought it down from the wood shop next door. They propped it up on a couple of old sawhorses so we wouldn't have to bend down so much while we took off all the original stuff we knew we weren't going to use. It's time to start disassembling. The first order of business was removing the original rear axle and sprocket from the go-kart. No problem, right?
I thought I'd get a jump on the old sprocket and squirted it with WD-40, thinking it would slide right off to get the axle out. We didn't have a deep set socket big enough to remove the hub nut, so I used my gigantic crescent wrench. We already had a pretty good idea that the hub wasn't going to slip off, so I tried using a puller. Too many years of rust, it wouldn't budge.
When all else fails, drag out the Sawzall. Now, we figured if we cut off the engine mounting plate, the rear axle could be lifted out. I hadn't cut very far when I realized it was about time to buy new blades for the saw. Okay, my part is done.
The Sawzall wore out my dad, so I took over to cut the back section of the engine mounting plate. Yeah, we definitely need new blades.
With the mounting plate sawed off, we lifted it off and tossed it in the scrap pile.
Go. Now that the old engine mounting plate is out of the way, removing the rear axle was a breeze.
Time for the non-essential parts of the original cart to go. Off came the remote kill switch, which didn't work anyway, the accelerator cable, and the brake pedal rod, which Austin never used when he was a kid.
Nothing was sliding off the rear axle, so we decided to cut the axle and then try to remove the sprocket. Our bandsaw from Harbor Freight is in dire need of a new blade, but it got the job done.
With the go-kart stripped down, it was time to take a break.
Chris decided he should be the first one to drive the KawaBunga.
A few years ago, Austin and I converted a 78 Yamaha XS 1100 into a cafe racer. Now, Chris found the old mufflers from the Yamaha and thought they'd look good on the KawaBunga. We'll see.
I took off all the body panels and gas tank from the Kawasaki. We'd already decided to keep the engine mounted in the frame and just install the whole thing as one unit when we put it in the go-kart. That way, we'd already have the radiator, battery, and gas tank mounted and ready to go.
Chris took off the front caliper, which will eventually be the rear caliper for the go-kart. The boys managed to get the whole front brake assembly off without tearing up anything.
Why does it go? We loosened up a couple bolts on the triple tree so we could slide out the front fork tubes. We've decided to use the motorcycle handlebars and controls on the go-kart instead of a steering wheel. That way, we'll have the accelerator, brake, and clutch within easy reach, just like a motorcycle. We'll also have the ignition switch already mounted right in front of us. The only thing operated by the foot will be the shifter. At the same time we're building the KawaBunga, my dad and I are also restoring a '79 Honda 750 for a friend of ours. I fabricated a spanner wrench out of half-inch square tubing and a couple screwdriver bits for the Honda. Luckily, it also fit the spanner nut on the Kawasaki. After a few turns with my fancy spanner wrench, the nut came right off.
It's the same as the Honda. Ready?
While Austin lifted the Kawasaki engine and frame, Chris pulled off the front tubes.
Alright, help me align. Woo! I feel like that could have been a lot worse.
That really wasn't too bad.
Next came the rear axle on the bike. Once the axle nut was off, Austin drove out the rear axle.
I knew we needed the Kawasaki sprocket for the go-kart, so I started unbolting it. Things were kind of tight between the swing arm and the sprocket didn't want to come off by itself.
Yes.
I decided to remove the master link from the chain so the whole rear wheel assembly could slide out the back. We wrapped up tearing the Kawasaki down by removing the swing arm and monoshock. All pretty routine stuff. The Kawasaki is now down to the bare essentials and ready to install on the back of the go-kart.
Well, that wraps up part one of the KawaBunga build.
In part 2, we'll begin the installation of the Kawasaki engine into the back of the go-kart. Thanks for watching!